A sea spider crawling across the seafloor with a leg span wider than a dinner plate. Not a crab, not a lobster. A sea spider. The same family of animal that almost everywhere else on the planet is small enough to sit comfortably on your fingernail. This one isn't. This one is the size of a dinner plate, walking on stilt-like legs through total darkness, using a mouth shaped like a drinking straw to suck the internal organs directly out of whatever it catches. And here's the part that should genuinely bother you. This isn't some deep-sea horror story from a random trench somewhere. This is completely normal for one specific ocean. This is just Tuesday at the bottom of the Antarctic, because something very strange is happening at the coldest, darkest, most hostile ocean on Earth. By almost every rule of biology, this water should be one of the emptiest places on the planet. Cold means slow. Slow means scarce. That's the pattern everywhere else, except in Antarctica, the exact opposite has happened. The cold hasn't shut life down, it's turned the volume up. Animals down there don't just survive the cold, many of them have used it to grow into versions of themselves that shouldn't exist anywhere else on Earth. So what is it about freezing, sunless water that builds monsters instead of killing everything off? And once you understand the actual mechanism behind it, you start to realize the giant sea spider isn't even the weirdest thing living down there. Why cold equals empty is usually true, and why Antarctica breaks it. If you know even a little bit about biology, cold and empty basically go hand in hand. Metabolism runs on temperature. Colder blood means slower chemical reactions, means less energy available, means smaller populations and smaller bodies. Look at the Antarctic continent itself, and the rule holds up perfectly. No trees, no land mammals, virtually no visible life beyond a fringe of penguins clinging to the coastline and a handful of hardy microbes buried in the rock. It's about as close to a dead landscape as you'll find anywhere on Earth that isn't literally a desert of pure rock. So you'd assume the ocean surrounding it, locked under ice and sitting at temperatures that would kill a human in minutes, would be an even emptier extension of that same dead zone. Less light, less warmth. Worse conditions in basically every category that normally supports life. Instead, the water underneath the Antarctic ice shelves might be one of the most densely populated ecosystems on the planet. Sprawling coral gardens, sponge fields dense enough to carpet the seafloor for miles, krill swarms thick enough to feed entire populations of whales every single year. And scattered throughout all of it, animals that have taken the exact conditions that should be killing them and used those conditions to become enormous. The reason comes down to a detail almost nobody thinks about. Cold water holds more oxygen than warm water. A lot more. And in an ecosystem this starved of competition, this starved of predators actively hunting for prey, and this rich in dissolved oxygen, evolution stops asking, how do I survive? And starts asking, how big can I actually get away with being? That question is called polar gigantism. And once you understand how it works, almost everything else about this ocean starts to make a strange kind of sense. Oxygen is the whole story. Here's the actual mechanism, and it's worth slowing down on because it explains basically every strange creature that's about to show up in this video. Every animal is limited at some level by how much oxygen it can physically move through its own body. On land, most animals breathe air directly, so this isn't usually the bottleneck. But underwater, animals are entirely dependent on how much dissolved oxygen exists in the water around them, and how efficiently their bodies can extract it. In warm tropical water, dissolved oxygen levels are relatively low, which puts a hard ceiling on how large an animal's body can get, before its own tissues start running short of oxygen faster than its gills or skin can supply it. That's a big part of why insects on land can only get so large. Their oxygen delivery system, a network of tiny tubes rather than lungs, simply can't service a body past a certain size. Cold water flips that entire equation. The colder the water, the more oxygen it can physically hold in solution, sometimes dramatically more than tropical water at the same depth. Now take an animal that relies on simple diffusion through its body surface to get oxygen, like, say, a sea spider, and put it in Antarctic water instead of a coral reef. Suddenly, that oxygen ceiling that was capping its body size in warm water simply isn't there anymore. There's enough dissolved oxygen available that the animal can grow far larger than its tropical relatives without suffocating from the inside. Combine that oxygen surplus with two other factors. Extremely slow metabolisms from the cold, which means animals need to eat less often and can survive on far less energy, and drastically reduced competition and predation pressure compared to a crowded coral reef. And you get an environment that essentially rewards getting bigger instead of punishing it. Slow, huge, and mostly left alone. That's the formula. And Antarctica has been running that formula for millions of years. So what does that formula actually produce? Let's start with the animal that opened this video. The sea spider, the size of a dinner plate. On a normal coral reef, sea spiders are almost invisible. Tiny, spindly creatures, usually under an inch across, that most divers never even notice crawling along the base of a reef. They're built almost entirely out of legs with a body so small and thin that their internal organs actually extend out into their legs because there isn't enough room to hold everything centrally. Drop a camera onto the Antarctic seafloor, and that same animal becomes something with a leg span that can stretch past 2 feet. Same basic bodies. Plan, same straw-like feeding mouth, same thin, spindly legs, just built at a scale that looks like it belongs in a different phylum entirely. These giant Antarctic sea spiders move slowly across the seafloor on stilt-like limbs, using that elongated mouthpart to pierce soft-bodied prey, like sponges and anemones, and drain the insides out, essentially feeding the same way a mosquito does, just at a scale that turns the whole process from mildly gross to genuinely unsettling. And because their oxygen exchange still happens through simple diffusion across their body surface, rather than through lungs or gills, the abundance of dissolved oxygen in the surrounding water is quite literally what allows a body this large to function without suffocating. Take that same animal and drop it into warm water, and its oversized body would starve for oxygen almost immediately. The cold isn't just where it happens to live. The cold is the reason it's allowed to exist at this size at all. But the sea spider is really just the entry-level example of what this ocean is capable of building. The deeper you go, the stranger it gets. Worms, isopods, and the rest. Of the giant lineup, sea spiders aren't the only animal running this same script. Giant isopods, distant armored relatives of the pillbugs you'd find under a rock in your backyard, follow the exact same pattern down here, growing into heavily plated scavengers that patrol the seafloor, picking apart anything that dies and sinks. Ribbon worms that would be a few inches long anywhere else stretch out to lengths measured in feet. Giant volcano sponges, some of the oldest living organisms on the planet, grow to sizes that would take up an entire room, quietly filtering water for what may be centuries at a time without moving an inch. None of these animals evolved some brand new exotic survival strategy to get this big. They're doing the exact same thing their tiny warm water cousins do. The same feeding behavior, the same basic body plan, the same lifestyle. The only variable that changed is the environment removing the ceiling that normally keeps them small. It's less like Antarctica invented monsters from scratch, and more like it took ordinary animals and simply forgot to install the size limit. And once you understand that the size limit is gone, it starts to make sense why the actual apex predators down here aren't just big, they're built like something out of a different era of Earth's history entirely. The colossal squid, the largest eyes on the planet. If the sea spider is the unsettling entry point, the colossal squid is the undisputed monster at the top of this ecosystem. This isn't the giant squid you've probably heard of from deep-sea documentaries. That's a different animal entirely, and a smaller one. The colossal squid is shorter overall, but dramatically heavier and more powerfully built, with a body that can weigh close to half a ton, thick enough that some individuals rival a small car in mass. Its arms and tentacles are lined with rotating hooks, not just suckers like most squid, but actual swiveling, sharp hooks embedded directly into the flesh of its limbs, meaning anything it grabs isn't just held, it's actively shredded the moment it tries to pull away. And then there are the eyes. The colossal squid has the largest eyes of any animal known to have ever existed, roughly the size of a dinner plate themselves, evolved specifically to gather the absolute faintest traces of bioluminescent light in water where sunlight has never once penetrated. In a world this dark, an eye that large isn't excessive. It's the bare minimum required to see anything at all, and here's the detail that should really put things in perspective. The colossal squid isn't even primarily a hunter of small, easy prey. It regularly ends up as food for sperm whales, and researchers studying sperm whale carcasses have found squid beaks and sucker scars on whale skin that suggest these fights are genuinely brutal, close-run contests rather than one-sided. Ambushes. An animal capable of leaving visible battle scars on a 50-ton predator is not a small player in this ecosystem. It's very possibly the single most dangerous invertebrate on the entire planet, and it spends its entire existence in water. Most human technology can barely survive in. But here's the part that should really unsettle you. The colossal squid isn't even the deepest, most extreme thing evolution has produced down here. It's just the one we happen to actually know about, because it occasionally drifts close enough to the edges of this ecosystem for a camera, fishing trawler, or a hungry sperm whale to actually run into it. The fish that shouldn't be able to exist. While the giants get most of the attention, some of the strangest adaptations in this entire ocean belong to animals you'd probably walk right past without noticing. The Antarctic icefish. Most fish would die almost instantly in water this cold. Ice crystals would form directly in their blood, shredding cells from the inside and killing the animal within minutes. Ice fish get around this using something that sounds like science fiction but is completely real. Their blood contains natural antifreeze glycoproteins, specialized molecules that physically bind to any ice crystal that tries to form and stop it from growing any further. It's not a metaphor. Their blood is functionally weaponized against freezing at a molecular level, and without it, this entire branch of the animal kingdom simply couldn't exist in this environment at all. And it gets stranger from there. Several ice fish species have lost the ability to produce hemoglobin entirely, the protein that gives blood its red color, and that almost every vertebrate on Earth relies on to carry oxygen. Their blood is functionally clear. On paper, this should be a catastrophic evolutionary dead end. Hemoglobin exists because it's a dramatically efficient way to transport oxygen through the body, and losing it should cripple an animal's ability to get enough oxygen to survive. But remember the oxygen surplus that's been driving this entire ecosystem. In water this saturated with dissolved oxygen, some ice fish species have been able to get away with dissolving oxygen directly into their blood plasma instead, skipping hemoglobin altogether, relying on oversized hearts and extensive networks of blood vessels to move enough of that dissolved oxygen around their bodies to survive. This is an adaptation that, as far as we know, doesn't exist successfully anywhere else on the planet. It's not just an animal tolerating extreme cold, it's an animal whose entire cardiovascular system had to be fundamentally restructured to survive here. And the restructuring only works because of the exact same oxygen surplus that's been building giant sea spiders and half-ton squid this entire video. So if the cold is capable of building bodies this extreme, what happens when you try to actually bring one of these animals somewhere else? Why you can't just bring them to a lab? You might assume the obvious next step for studying any of this is simple. Catch a few specimens, bring them up to the surface, and study them properly in a controlled lab environment. This is where things get genuinely frustrating, because for a huge number of these animals, doing exactly that ends up killing them. These creatures haven't just tolerated cold water. Their entire biology, every protein, every enzyme, every cell membrane, has spent millions of years being fine-tuned to function at one extremely narrow temperature range, typically hovering right around the freezing point of seawater. Pull one of these animals up toward the surface, even into water that's still objectively freezing by human standards, and to that animal's biology, the temperature shift can be roughly equivalent to being dropped into boiling water. Their metabolism spikes almost instantly, demanding far more oxygen than their bodies are equipped to extract at that temperature, and they can suffocate in a matter of minutes. Worse, the sudden warmth can cause their specialized cold-adapted proteins to physically unfold and lose their shape. The literal molecular structure that lets their cells function starts falling apart in real time. We can't survive down there. And the moment we try to bring them up here, a huge number of them can't survive either. It's one of the only ecosystems on Earth where studying the animal properly and keeping the animal alive are frequently two mutually exclusive goals, which means an enormous amount of what actually lives in this ocean we only get to observe for the brief window it survives on a research vessel deck, if we're lucky enough to catch it at all. And that's assuming we can even get a camera close enough to find these animals in the first place, which, as it turns out, is its own separate nightmare. We've barely even looked. Here's the detail that puts everything in this video into perspective. Almost everything described so far comes from the edges of this ecosystem, the shallow margins near research stations, the occasional trawl net, the rare ROV that manages to survive a dive under the ice shelf for a few hours before the cold shuts. It down. The deep interior of this ocean, the trenches sitting directly underneath the thickest, most permanent sections of the ice shelves, hundreds of miles from any research station or accessible opening, remains almost completely unexplored. That's not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. It's the actual scale of the problem. Dropping a small camera down a narrow borehole through a mile of solid ice and getting a few hours of footage of a small patch of seafloor isn't ocean exploration in any meaningful sense. It's closer to trying to understand an entire ecosystem by peering. Through a keyhole with a dying flashlight, you might catch a glimpse of one animal in one tiny patch of water for a few minutes, and then the hole freezes back over and that's it. Which means everything covered in this video, the giant sea spiders, the colossal squid, the antifreeze-blooded ice fish, represents what we've managed to find purely by accident, at the fringes of an ecosystem that mostly remains completely dark to us. If gigantism and molecular level adaptations this extreme are what evolution has produced at the edges, where at least occasional contact happens, it raises an obvious and slightly uncomfortable question. What has it had millions of years to build in the parts we've genuinely never seen at all? The tiny animal, holding the whole system together. For all the attention giants like the colossal squid get, the actual foundation of this ecosystem isn't a giant at all. It's Antarctic krill, a shrimp-like creature barely 2 inches long. And krill matter here for a reason that ties directly back into everything already covered in this video: biomass. Estimates put the total combined weight of Antarctic krill in the hundreds of millions of tons, making it, by some measures, one of the single largest concentrations of animal biomass on the entire planet, rivaling or exceeding the total weight of the entire human species. That number only makes sense once you understand the same oxygen-rich, low-competition conditions driving polar gigantism elsewhere in this ecosystem. Krill swarms can stretch for miles and pack so densely that they visibly stain patches of ocean, a deep reddish brown from satellite imagery. That density is what allows every other layer of this food web to exist at the scale it does. The whales, the seals, the penguins, and yes, indirectly, even the giant squid and the ice fish further down the chain all ultimately draw their energy from swarms of this one small animal, which means the fragility running through this entire ecosystem doesn't just apply to the strange giants, it applies to the tiny animal underneath all of them. Krill reproduction and survival are directly tied to sea ice, juvenile krill shelter, and feed on algae, growing on the underside of sea ice through the winter months, meaning a shift in how much ice forms each year has a direct, measurable effect on how many krill exist to feed everything above them. Pull on that one thread hard enough, and it isn't just the giant sea spiders or the antifreeze-blooded ice fish at risk. It's the animal quietly holding the entire structure together underneath them. The bigger the advantage, the bigger the risk. There's a pattern worth pointing out before wrapping this up, because it applies to basically every animal in this video, every single adaptation. That makes these creatures so strange also makes them incredibly fragile the moment their environment changes even slightly. The giant sea spider's entire body plan only works because of the oxygen surplus in cold water. Shift that water even a few degrees warmer, and the same oversized body that let it thrive becomes a liability it can no longer support. The ice fish's clear, hemoglobin-free blood is a brilliant solution to an oxygen-rich, ice-cold environment, and a potential death sentence in anything else. These animals didn't evolve to be flexible. They evolved to be precisely suited to one specific, narrow set of conditions. And that precision is exactly what makes them vulnerable to a world that's currently warming faster at the poles than almost anywhere else on Earth. That's the quiet irony sitting underneath this entire ecosystem. The exact same cold, oxygen-rich, isolated conditions that allowed evolution to build sea spiders the size of dinner plates and squid with the largest eyes on the planet are conditions that took millions of years to get exactly right, and could unravel in a fraction of that time if the water around them keeps warming even slightly. The strangeness isn't a fluke. It's the product of an extraordinarily stable, extraordinarily specific set of circumstances. And extraordinarily specific things tend to be the first to break when circumstances change. So the next time someone tells you the ocean has basically been fully explored, or that Earth doesn't have any real mysteries left, it might be worth pointing out that there's a body of water on this exact planet right now, actively growing animals into shapes that look like they belong in a different era of evolutionary history, and we've only ever managed to glimpse the edges of it. Somewhere under a mile of ice in total darkness, something down there has had millions of uninterrupted years to figure out exactly how big it can get. And honestly, I think I'm okay not finding out exactly what that looks like anytime soon. Thanks for watching. Drop your suggestions for what we should cover next down in the comments. I genuinely read every single one. And if you want to see exactly what happens when we try to actually get equipment down into this ocean in the first place, check out the video on screen right now.